They summoned her to be humiliated, to prove their future was secure. But the moment her son stepped forward, the throne answered him instead. If she was never barren, then who lied? And what does this child mean for the throne? Before the story pulls you in, know this. This channel tells stories about the ones power tried to erase, the women silenced for convenience, the children declared impossible, and the truth buried to protect thrones. If stories like this speak to you, you're already one of us. Subscribe, and let's keep telling the stories that refuse to kneel. And one more gentle thing before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And when the story ends, come back and rate it for me from 0 to 10. Your rating helps shape the next stories I tell. Now, let's begin. The Great Iron Hall had stood for 6 centuries, and in all that time, its stones had never questioned the men who ruled from within them. Alpha King Vector Salrith sat upon the throne as he always did, shoulders squared, spine rigid, one gauntlet hand resting on the ancient armrest carved with runes his ancestors had bled to claim. The ceremonial armor he wore caught the firelight from the braziers flanking the dais, throwing sharp shadows across the red banners that hung from the vaulted ceiling. Each banner bore the 3-clawed sigil of the Ironclaw Dominion, a reminder that power here was earned through strength and inherited through blood. Around him, the court had assembled in their finest regalia. Sentinels lined the walls in formation, their expressions as immovable as the stone behind them. At the base of the throne, the royal council stood in a semicircle, their aged faces solemn beneath ceremonial hoods. This was theater as much as governance, and every soul present understood their role. The rite of ascendant blood will commence at the next full moon, Vector announced, his voice carrying through the hall with the authority of a man who had never been denied. The realm will bear witness to the validation of our future. Tradition demands it. Stability requires it. Elder Morvieth stepped forward, his staff striking the floor twice. The bloodline must be secured, Alpha King. Legacy is the spine upon which this kingdom stands. Without it, we are merely beasts in the forest. Vector nodded, though something flickered behind his eyes. Brief, quickly smothered. The Rite will remind our people that leadership is not a matter of sentiment. It is a matter of survival. He did not say her name. He had not spoken it aloud in years. But the memory surfaced regardless, unbidden and sharp. Selena, standing in this very hall, her chin raised even as the council pronounced judgment. Barren. The word had echoed off the stones like a curse. Unfit to bear the future of the Dominion. She had not wept. She had not begged. She had simply looked at him, her fated mate, her king, and waited for him to speak. Vector had remained silent. He told himself it had been a necessity. The council had presented their evidence. Lunar cycles ignored, ancient signs absent, the whispers of the court growing too loud to ignore. A king could not appear weak. A king could not let emotion override duty. So he had watched as the ceremonial severance was performed, watched as Selena was escorted from the hall, watched as the bond between them was declared void. The bond had never truly broken. It had simply learned to ache quietly. The summons had been sent, Elder Thaldrin said, pulling Vector back to the present. To all corners of the realm. Even to, he paused delicately. Even to the exiled. Vector's jaw tightened. She will attend. She will stand witness to what this kingdom has become without her. Let her see what strength looks like. The council murmured approval. None of them questioned. None of them challenged. That, Vector thought, was how a kingdom should function. Certainty. Order. Control. The braziers flickered as wind swept through the hall's high windows, and for just a moment, the runes on the throne seemed to pulse with a light that had nothing to do with fire. The summons arrived on parchment sealed with iron dark wax, the 3-clawed sigil pressed deep enough to tear the paper at its edges. Selina Lyran held it to the light of her workroom window, reading the formal script without expression. Around her, shelves lined with salvaged texts and carefully labeled vials stood as testament to the years she had spent rebuilding herself from exile. The cottage was small, nestled at the edge of the Greyvale territories where forgotten packs kept their own council, but it had become more home than the great Iron Hall had ever been. "He's summoning you to the Rite," said Maris, the elderly healer who had taken Selina in when she'd arrived 7 years ago, hollow-eyed and silent. The arrogance of it. Selina set the parchment down with deliberate care. "He's summoning me to remind his court what happens to those deemed unworthy. A warning, dressed as a ceremony. You don't have to go." "No," Selina agreed quietly. "I don't. But she would. Not for Vector. Not even for vindication. She would go because the lies that had exiled her were still being taught as truth, and truth had become something she could no longer ignore. The first year of exile had been survival. The second had been grief, raw and relentless, for the mate bond that still thrummed beneath her ribs like a second heartbeat, for the future she'd been forbidden to claim. But by the third year, something had shifted. Grief had clarified into purpose. In the territories beyond Ironclaw's borders, Selina had discovered what Vector's council had either forgotten or deliberately buried. She had studied with healers who remembered the old ways, scholars who kept records the Dominion deemed irrelevant, elders from smaller packs whose knowledge had never been codified into law. She learned that lunar cycles were guides, not absolutes. That conception among fated mates often required years, not months. That some alpha bloodlines awakened late, their power dormant until circumstance or maturity called it forth. She learned that she had been condemned not by nature, but by impatience and fear. Pause for a second. Selina didn't fail. She was failed. And if this story makes you angry, if it hurts because it feels real, then walking away without subscribing means letting stories like hers stay buried. This channel tells the stories that power wants forgotten. Subscribe because silence is how injustice survives. Let's continue. The council had wanted certainty. They had needed a reason for her failure to conceive within the first year of mating. So they had plucked folklore from outdated texts, ignored the nuances of biology, and declared her barren with the confidence of men who had never been questioned. Vector had let them. That was the wound that had taken longest to heal, not the exile itself, but his silence in the face of it. Selina moved to the small desk where she kept her most precious acquisitions, a collection of scrolls purchased from a traveling archivist, records from packs that predated the Dominion's formation. One passage, marked with a strip of faded ribbon, detailed the bloodline of an alpha whose heir had not shown dominance until his 8th year. Another described conception occurring only after a mate bond had been tested by separation and reunion. The evidence had always existed. It had simply been inconvenient. She traced the text with one finger, then looked toward the doorway where Ralvik stood watching her, his small frame silhouetted against the afternoon light. He was 7 years old, sharp-eyed and patient beyond his years, and he had her mother's coloring but his father's jawline. "We're going, aren't we?" he asked. Selina smiled, and it was neither bitter nor cruel. "Yes, little one. We're going home." Ralvik had always known he was different, though his mother had never named it as such. He noticed it first with the animals. The feral dogs that roamed the outskirts of Greyvale would bare their teeth at travelers, but they lowered their heads when he passed, ears flat, bellies exposed in submission. The horses in the stable grew still when he entered, their restless stamping quieted by his presence. Once, a wolf had wandered into the village during a harsh winter, starving and desperate. The hunters had reached for their weapons, but Ralvik had simply stepped forward, palm outstretched, and the wolf had whined low in its throat before turning back toward the forest. His mother had watched from the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Why do they do that?" he had asked later, sitting at the table while she prepared their evening meal. Because they recognized something in you, Selena had answered carefully. Something true. She never called it power. She never called it destiny. She taught him restraint before strength, empathy before authority, observation before action. When other children boasted of their father's titles or their bloodline's histories, Ralvik learned to listen instead of speak. When disputes arose in the village, Selena would bring him along, showing him how words could resolve what force could not. A title is a word others give you, she told him one evening as they walked through the forest. But who you are, that is something you must choose for yourself. He understood even then that she was preparing him for something. He simply did not know what. The dreams had started a year ago. In them, he stood in a vast hall of stone and firelight, surrounded by red banners that billowed though there was no wind. Runes covered every surface, ancient and angular, and they glowed with a silver-white light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. He could feel eyes on him, dozens of them, hundreds, but when he turned to look, the figures watching were only shadows. Always, the dream ended the same way, a throne of iron and carved stone, empty and waiting. He never told his mother about the dreams. Some instinct warned him that naming them would give them weight, would make them real in a way he was not yet ready to accept. But she knew. Of course she knew. Mothers always did. The day before they left for the Ironclaw Dominion, Selena brought him to the village elder, a grizzled warrior named Torvin who had served in a dozen packs before settling in Grey Vale. The old man studied Ralvik for a long moment, then glanced at Selena with something like awe in his weathered face. He has the presence, Torvin said quietly. Even untrained, even this young, I feel the urge to kneel. Selena's jaw tightened. He is a child, Torvin, not a weapon. No, the elder agreed, still watching Ralvik. But he will be a leader. And leaders must understand the weight they carry before others place crowns upon their heads. That night, as Ralvik lay in bed, he heard his mother moving through the cottage, packing their belongings with quiet efficiency. He closed his eyes and saw the throne again, clearer than ever before. This time, he did not wake before reaching it. The official language of the summons was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty. By decree of Alpha King Vector Salrith, sovereign of the Ironclaw Dominion, let it be known that all subjects of the realm are commanded to bear witness to the right of ascendant blood. In the interest of historical record and the honoring of tradition, the presence of Selena Lyren, formerly of the royal house, is hereby required. Let her attendance serve as testament to the enduring strength of the throne and the wisdom of decisions made in service to the realm's continuity. Selena read the passage aloud to Maris, her voice steady, clinical. He doesn't even use my title. Formerly of the royal house, as if I were staff dismissed for incompetence. It's designed to wound, Maris said, her hands pausing over the herbs she was grinding. To remind you of what you lost.
No.
Selena set the parchment down, her fingers tracing the embossed seal one last time. It's designed to remind his court. I am meant to be an object lesson, a cautionary tale of what happens when bloodlines fail. She looked up, and her eyes were clear. He wants me to stand in that hall, silent and diminished, so that every noble present will understand the cost of weakness. The political calculation was transparent once you stopped feeling and started thinking. Vector needed to solidify his chosen heir's legitimacy, and nothing reinforced new power quite like displaying the ruins of the old. By summoning her, he created a narrative. The barren mate who had failed, now witnessing the future she could not provide. It was a theater. It was controlled. It was the final severing of a wound he believed had already healed. What Vector did not know, what the council could not know, was that the wound had never existed in the first place. You're going to tell them, Maris said quietly. It was not a question. I'm going to show them. Selena moved to the window, watching Ralvik in the yard below as he helped repair a neighbor's fence. His movements were careful, deliberate, the way she had taught him. Truth without evidence is just noise. But evidence, presented at the right moment, becomes irrefutable. She had spent years gathering that evidence. Texts that predated the Dominion's formation. Healer testimonies from pacts whose wisdom had not been corrupted by political expedients. Biological records that detailed conception cycles spanning 3, 5, even 7 years among fated mates. She had documentation of alpha heirs whose power awakened late, whose dominance did not manifest until circumstance demanded it. The council had declared her barren after 12 months. 12 months, as if nature operated on the schedule of impatient men. "When will you tell Ralvik?" Maris asked. About his father. About the throne. Selena turned from the window. When it matters. Not before. That evening, as she prepared their travel packs, Ralvik appeared in the doorway. He had grown tall for his age, all lean lines and watchful eyes. "I'm coming with you," he said, and it was not a request. "I know. They'll try to make you kneel." "They'll try," Selena agreed, meeting his gaze. "But I stopped kneeling the day they exiled me. I won't start again now." Ralvik nodded slowly, something ancient flickering behind his young features. "Then I'll stand beside you." She crossed the room and placed her hands on his shoulders. "Not beside me, Ralvik. You'll stand where you choose to stand. That's the difference between them and us. They demand a position. We offer presence." Understanding passed between them, wordless and complete. Tomorrow, they would return to the Ironclaw Dominion, not as supplicants, not as ghosts of past failures, but as living proof that truth waits for no one's permission to exist. The great Iron Hall had been transformed into something between cathedral and battlefield. Sacred flames rose from braziers arranged in ritual formation, their smoke carrying the scent of ceremonial herbs that had been burned at every succession for 300 years. The elders stood in a circle around the dais, their voices rising and falling in the ancient chant that was supposed to call forth the approval of ancestral spirits. Every surface gleamed with preparation, every banner hung in perfect alignment, every sentinel positioned with mathematical precision. At the center of it all stood Darian Cormith, the chosen successor. He was broad-shouldered and confident, a skilled warrior from a respected bloodline, and he wore the ceremonial armor of an heir apparent with practiced ease. The court watched him with expressions that blended admiration with carefully concealed doubt. He looked the part. He sounded the part when he spoke the ritual words. But something was missing. Everyone felt it, though none would name it. The flames burned, but they did not dance. The runes on the throne remained dark. The air itself seemed to wait, holding its breath for something that had not yet arrived. Then the great doors opened. Silence fell like a blade. Selena Lyren entered the great iron hall as she had left it 7 years ago, unbowed, composed, her green gown simple but immaculate. She did not hesitate at the threshold. She did not flinch under the weight of hundreds of stairs. She walked the length of the hall with the measured grace of someone who had nothing left to prove and nothing left to fear. Beside her walked a child. The murmurs began immediately, rippling through the assembly like wind through tall grass. But the whispers died as quickly as they started, because something else was happening. The sentinels along the walls had gone rigid, their hands moving unconsciously toward their weapons not in threat, but in instinctive deference. Several of the older warriors shifted their weight, eyes widening with recognition they could not possibly name. The boy was small, dark-haired, unremarkable in every visible way. Yet the hall responded to him. Right now, you're watching the future walk into a room built on lies. If stories like this deserve to be told, if children like Ralvik deserve a world that doesn't erase them before they're born, then don't just watch. Stand with us. Subscribe and become part of a growing movement that protects truth, even when it scares the powerful. One subscriber at a time. We rewrite the future. Let's continue. The flames in the braziers flickered, their light shifting from orange to something paler, something that caught silver in its depths. The runes carved into the stone throne began to glow faintly, each ancient symbol pulsing with a rhythm that matched the sudden hammering of Vector's heart. The Alpha King rose from his seat without meaning to, his body responding to something his mind had not yet accepted. The mate bond, dormant and aching for 7 years, surged to life with such force that he had to brace himself against the throne's armrest. He knew. Some part of him that existed beneath reason and politics and pride simply knew. The boy met his gaze across the hall, and Vector felt the urge, undeniable and instinctive, to bow. He fought it. Of course he fought it. He was Alpha King. He bowed to no one, least of all a child whose very existence was impossible. But his wolf knew better. His blood knew better. Darian Cormith had stopped speaking mid-ritual, his carefully rehearsed words abandoned as he stared at the child. The elders' chanting faltered, then ceased entirely. Even Elder Morvieth, who had presided over Selina's exile, had gone pale. Selina stopped 10 paces from the dais. She did not kneel. She did not bow. She simply stood, one hand resting lightly on Ralvik's shoulder, and waited. "Alpha King Vector," she said, her voice carrying through the shocked silence. "You summoned me to bear witness. I have come." She paused, and the faintest smile touched her lips. "And I have brought your witness." Ralvik did not plan to move. His feet simply carried him forward, as if the hall itself were pulling him toward the dais. The moment he crossed the threshold of the ritual circle, the ceremonial flames erupted upward, their color bleeding from orange to brilliant silver-white. The light was blinding, cold and clean, and it cast shadows that seemed to carve truth from stone. Every rune on the throne ignited simultaneously, not the faint glow Vector had seen moments before, but a radiance so fierce that nobles shielded their eyes. The elders stumbled backward, their chanting forgotten. Elder Morvieth's staff clattered to the floor. Throughout the hall, warriors dropped to one knee without command, their bodies responding to an authority older than law or tradition. The sentinels who had stood rigid for hours bent, as if pushed by invisible hands. Even Darian Cormith, the chosen successor, sank slowly to the ground, his face a mask of confusion and dawning understanding. Vector alone remained standing, but it cost him everything. The mate bond did not roar with possessive fury. It did not surge with territorial dominance. Instead, it coiled around his heart like judgment itself, forcing him to feel every moment of Selina's exile, every silent year, every truth he had refused to question. The bond showed him what he had chosen not to see, that fear of appearing weak had made him complicit in cruelty. That certainty without evidence was simply arrogance with a crown. His wolf howled inside him, not in rage, but in recognition. Not submission, acknowledgement. Ralvik stopped before the throne, a child of 7 standing in a hall of kneeling warriors, and raised his eyes to meet his father's. Selina's voice cut through the charged silence, clear and merciless in its calm. 7 years ago, this court declared me Barren based on 12 months of conception attempts. 12 months, when the biological record of alpha-mate pairings documents cycles ranging from 2 to 8 years. She gestured to Ralvik without looking away from Vector. "You called me here to witness your chosen future. Instead, you will witness the son you exiled before he was born." The throne runes pulsed brighter, responding not to ceremony or ritual words, but to blood, to truth, to the future that had been waiting in exile while politics played at permanence. "The question before this court," Selina continued, "is not whether I was barren. It is whether you will continue building kingdoms on lies, or whether you will finally learn that truth does not require your permission to exist. Elder Morvieth found his voice first, though it trembled. This is impossible. The lunar readings were clear. The traditions. What traditions? Selena withdrew a scroll from within her cloak, its edges worn from study. This is a bloodline record from the North Vale Pack, dated 2 centuries before the Dominion's formation. It documents an alpha heir whose dominance manifested in his 9th year. Not his first, his 9th. She let the scroll unfurl. There are 17 similar cases recorded here. 17. The silence that followed was suffocating. "You knew," someone whispered from the assembly. A young scholar, one of the court's record keepers. "The archives. I've seen texts marked as restricted. I thought they were military secrets." Elder Thaldrin's face had gone ashen. The council deemed certain knowledge destabilizing. "We believed." "You believed it was easier to condemn one woman than to admit uncertainty," Selena said, and her voice held no rage, only devastating clarity. "You chose convenient certainty over uncomfortable truth because admitting you didn't know would have weakened your authority." Morvieth opened his mouth, closed it. His hands shook. The kingdom required stability. After the border wars, after the succession disputes, we could not afford doubt. A king without an heir is a kingdom without a future. "So you invented one," Selena replied. "You declared me barren not because healers confirmed it, not because nature revealed it, but because 12 months felt too long to wait. You dressed fear in the language of tradition and called it wisdom." She turned to address the entire hall, her voice carrying to every corner. How many other truths have been buried because they were inconvenient? How many lives reshaped to fit the council's need for control? The court began to stir, nobles exchanging glances that held new suspicion. Warriors who had knelt now rose slowly, their expressions no longer certain. Elder Morvieth's composure finally cracked. "We acted in what we believed were the kingdom's best interests. We," his voice broke. "We did not know. We truly did not know." "That," Selena said quietly, "is precisely the problem. You ruled without knowledge and called it leadership. You governed through fear and called it strength. And you nearly destroyed the future you claimed to protect." The throne runes pulsed once more, as if in agreement, their light reflecting off faces that would never see authority quite the same way again. Vector descended from the dais with movements that felt both ancient and inevitable. The great iron hall had witnessed many ceremonies, but never this, an alpha king lowering himself to one knee before his exiled mate and the son he had never known. His armor made no sound. The assembled court barely breathed. This moment only happens because someone refused to stay silent. Imagine how many Selenas never got this justice because people looked away. If you're still watching, then you already care. Don't pretend neutrality. Neutrality is how lies stay crowned. Subscribe and choose the side of truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Let's continue. "I failed you," Vector said, and his voice carried no excuses, no justifications. "I failed you both. I let pride silence doubt, and I let politics replace principle." He reached up, removed the crown from his head, and held it forward. "This belongs to him, to the future I almost destroyed." The mate bond surged between them, aching with 7 years of separation and suppressed longing. Selena felt it like a physical touch, the pull toward completion, toward forgiveness, toward the destiny that fate had supposedly designed. She did not step forward. "Stand up, Vector," she said quietly. He looked up at her, confusion and hope warring in his expression. "Stand up," she repeated, "because I will not accept offerings made from your knees. Crowns given out of guilt are as worthless as crowns kept through lies." Slowly, Vector rose, the crown still extended. Selena shook her head. "You summoned me here to shame me for a failure that never existed. You built this ceremony on my disgrace, this legacy on my supposed inadequacy. She gestured to Ralvik, who watched with ancient eyes in a young face. The mate bond does not excuse what you allowed. Destiny does not erase accountability. I do not want her crown, Vector. I want you to understand that leadership is not something you are given once and keep forever. It is something you must earn with every decision, every moment of courage or cowardice. She took Ralvik's hand. He is your son. That is the biological truth. But whether he becomes your heir, that will depend on what you build from this moment forward. Not what you claim, not what you are owed, what you earn. The hall remained silent, but it was a different silence now. Not the stunned hush of shock, but the heavy quiet of witnessing something fundamental shift. Vector lowered the crown, his throat working. What would you have me do? Learn, Selena said simply. Question. Listen to voices you would rather silence. Build a kingdom that values truth over tradition when tradition becomes tyranny. She met his eyes. And never, ever mistake destiny for permission to cause harm. Ralvik did not reach for the crown. He stood before the throne, small and still, while the silver-white flames gradually returned to their natural orange. The runes on the stone began to dim, their message delivered, their judgment passed. Around the hall, warriors rose from their knees not because they were commanded to, but because the moment of revelation had completed itself. An old soldier near the back spoke first, his voice rough with emotion. I know Alpha presence when I feel it. That boy carries what cannot be taught or manufactured. Another voice joined, then another. Not declarations of fealty or forced obeisance, but simple acknowledgement. The truth, once revealed, required no enforcement. Vector watched his son, truly saw him for the first time, and understood that power built on fear would always be fragile, while power rooted in truth could endure. The council will be restructured, Vector announced, his voice carrying the weight of genuine resolve. Evidence will replace assumption. Healers, scholars, historians, their voices will guide governance alongside warrior wisdom. What we believed will be tested against what we know. Elder Morvieth, still pale, nodded slowly. The archives will be opened. All of them. And the succession? Someone called from the assembly. Vector looked at Ralvik, then at Selena. The boy will be educated, trained, given time to understand the weight he carries before we ask him to bear it. Leadership is not stolen in a moment. It is cultivated over years. Ralvik met his father's gaze and nodded once, a gesture that held neither judgment nor absolution, only understanding. Selena turned toward the great doors, her purpose fulfilled. She had not come for reconciliation or revenge. She had come to end a lie, and the lie was ended. Selena, Vector called. She paused but did not turn. Will you return? That, she said quietly, depends on what you build from here. Not what you promise, what you do. She walked through the doors with Ralvik at her side, leaving behind a hall full of people who would spend years unlearning certainty and relearning humility. The throne stood empty, waiting. Not for force or birthright or destiny alone, but for someone wise enough to understand that the greatest power lies not in commanding others, but in serving truth. The future, at last, could begin. Thank you for staying until the end. By watching, by subscribing, you're proving that stories rooted in truth still matter, that exile doesn't get the final word, and silence is not the ending. This channel is building something bigger than one story. More voices, more justice, more truth every single day. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is your moment to belong. And before you go, tell me in the comments what you thought about this story. Did it make you angry, hopeful, emotional, or quiet in that way only truth can do? I read your thoughts, and they matter more than you know.